I believe it was in December on the 31st of 2005, when we held our first community labyrinth walk to celebrate the New Year's Eve evening. We had about 35 people here that evening from the community. The following year we had 85, so it was very well received. The following year we had a blizzard, snow sideways, so we didn't do it. But that first year and the second year also, we had this. I gave the folks the instructions. As you walk into the labyrinth and that pathway that leads eventually to the center, I asked them to focus their attention on the old year and the things that had happened in the old year, especially those things that were painful to them, that still had their hooks in them, that were still causing them some difficulty. And do their very best to release those, to let go of those, to encourage those things to let go of them and offer them to God. And then I asked them, as they walked out of the labyrinth, to begin to think of the ways they would like to have their lives open to God's activity in the new year. And then as they finished their walk, we had two tables set up. One table was called the Old Year table. And we had 4x6 cards on that table and pens. And we asked them to write down those things that old year still had hooks in them that they needed to let go of, offer to God. And when they'd done that, we had a little charcoal grill fire going, and we invited them to put those cards on the grill. And as the smoke and ash went heavenward, to feel that releasing for them and those things being offered to God visually. And then we had a New Year table. And on the New Year table, we invited them, we also had cards and envelopes, and we asked them to write down on those cards the ways they wanted to be open to God's activity in their lives in the new year. And then we asked them to put those cards in the envelope, seal the envelope, and address it to themselves. And in June of that new year, we sent those out to everybody, reminding them how they had indicated they wanted to be open to God's activity, to see how they measure themselves against what they'd hoped as a way to do that. It seemed to be very popular because the next year, like I said, we had more than double the number of people. But as with each year at this time, we have the opportunity to take a look back and to take a look forward. Now, the backward look is much more clear. I understand that. The television is filled now with looking back opportunities. Barbara Walters had the 10 most fascinating people from her perspective of 2014, interviewed them all. We look back at sports personalities and other things, the movies. We're looking back to see what was the best and what was the worst of 2014. But as we look forward into 2015, we can't see very far. But this is the time of year when we have hopes and dreams for the next year and how we might change our lives or live our lives in a different way. Well, I think that these three passages of Scripture are also little vignettes in Scripture of opportunities for the people of Israel to say goodbye to something, not necessarily an old year, but say goodbye and say hello. And I'd like to look at each of those texts and see what those goodbyes were and what the hellos were, because we have an opportunity in hindsight to see what the hellos were too, that they didn't have as they were saying hello to something new. The Exodus text tells us that after 430 years in Egypt, it was time to leave. And in leaving, They said goodbye to security. They had a place to live. They had food to eat. They had work that oftentimes was overwhelming. They were saying goodbye to hardship. They were saying goodbye to oppression. But they were saying goodbye. They were saying goodbye to a life that they had come to know as familiar. Even though difficult, it was familiar. And they were embarking on something that they didn't know where they were going. They didn't know what lay ahead. In fact, as we read the story further, they were really upset with Moses for taking them out of there. We'd be better off if we were back in Egypt, they said. But they had to say goodbye before they could say hello to the new year and the new adventures to which they were being called and led. A psychologist whose writings were very popular in the middle of the 20th century, Eric Berne, a Canadian, developed a theory of personal relationships called transactional analysis that became very popular and is still being explored today. One of his most popular books was entitled Games People Play. And he described different ways that people engage in games with each other, none of which were healthy according to him. But he wrote another book, and the title of that book was, What Do You Say After You Say Hello? And in that book, he developed a theory that in order to be able to really say hello to something new, you have to really say goodbye to something old. So the Israelites, well, they really weren't even the Israelites in Egypt. They were the family of Jacob, the extended family. 430 years of family. But when they left Egypt, crossed the Red Sea, and into the wilderness, they had many things they needed to say hello to. One of which was uncertainty. And it caused them a lot of anxiety as they wandered in the wilderness with a new leader, Moses, who some of them weren't really sure that they wanted to be following him because of some of the things that he had done. There were challenges. They were creating a nation that came to be known as the nation of Israel. Jacob's name, Israel. The nation now, not just the family, but the nation of Israel. They had enemies. In Egypt, the enemy, I guess, was the Egyptians that turned eventually. But now they had new enemies. And they had to deal with that. They now had to depend on God to lead them with the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire, rather than Pharaoh and his leaders to take care of them and lead them. But in saying hello to that, they became a nation with a future that was designed to be God-centered as no other had been. Well, the book of Ezra is also now dealing with the Israelites. And in the book of Ezra, the text we read today, the Israelites were saying goodbye to captivity. They'd been in captivity for 70 years. They were captured by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. For 70 years or 69 years, they were his exiles. They were living in Babylon. They were imported directly from Israel to Babylon. And then Nebuchadnezzar ran up against a more powerful force in Cyrus of Persia, who defeated him. 1 year after the defeat, Cyrus said, Israelites, you're going home. Very, very few of them had ever been to Israel or to Jerusalem. Very few. They'd heard about it. They'd worshiped. But it was hard for them to worship because the concept was that God lived in Jerusalem and Judah, not in Babylon. The Babylonians asked them to sing a song along the rivers of Babylon, and they said, how do we sing a new song when we're not home? Even though they'd never lived there. They knew that that wasn't their home. So they were leaving again. Hardship. They were saying hello to uncertainty, to hard work and rebuilding Jerusalem and the wall of Jerusalem. And as you read that book further, you see some of the challenges that came to Ezra and his cohort of leaders to make that all happen and build the temple. They'd never seen the temple, but they had to rebuild the temple. They had to become self-governing again. But we also know now, in hindsight, what value that was to them as a nation and their identity as a people. And the third text, in the Gospel of John, it's the disciples saying goodbye to Jesus for the first time when he was on the cross. And in saying goodbye to him, they were saying goodbye to their dreams and hopes. Because they all had ideas about what the future was going to be with Jesus as the leader. And now here he is, dead on a cross. What do we do now? How can we get on? We must go into hiding. But they were saying hello to the Holy Spirit, whom Jesus in chapter 14 of John promised them an advocate who would be with them forever. That was God's Spirit. They're saying hello to challenges. They were saying hello to persecution. They were saying hello to forming the church and changing the world. Little did they know what that all meant, but that's what they were saying hello to. They were opening themselves to that unknown future. What might we learn from these goodbyes and hellos that can help us as we stand on the threshold of a new year? A time of looking back and a time of looking forward. Saying goodbye to what's behind us because we can't change any of that. Reminds me of the story of 100 years ago, a couple of fellows were talking about the Civil War and who really should have won. One was a Yankee and one was a rebel. And they were having a pretty heated argument about who should have won the war. And the rebel was convinced that they should have won. And someone overhearing this loud discussion, shall we call it, came over and said, guys, listen, let's take 5 minutes and think as seriously as we can about the years 1861 to 1865 and all that happened that we know about in those years, and see if it changes the outcome of the war. Of course it didn't. It can't. It's all been written. It's all history. But he said to them, but we can look forward to what's coming to us and see if we can live our way through that in a positive way and make a difference where we're going. We can't change where we've been. We can only change where we're going. So, I think one of the things that we can do with 2014 is say goodbye. There have been some really good things that happened in 2014 to you personally, to us as a congregation, to us as a world. There have been some not so good things that have happened to you personally and to our community and to our world. None of which we can change. None of which we can change. So we can say goodbye to that. To use Eric Burns' idea, we have to say goodbye to it so that we can be open to the new year. and the potential that it holds. There was good and bad, there was joy and pain. It's all history. And grief, the second thing is that grief is our own internal response to every goodbye. Every goodbye. Whether we're saying goodbye to a person for the final time at a memorial service or funeral, whether we're saying goodbye to someone who's been with us for Christmas and the holiday and they're going home, whether we're saying goodbye to something that we've had for days or years to which we've grown attached, there's a grief response. And the more intense our feelings for that person or thing, the more intense the grieving is that we do. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, psychiatrist, is famous, her book on death and dying. What she did over a significant span of time was interview people who were dying or who had family members who were dying. And then she cataloged those common experiences that she discovered in those people, and she called them the stages of grief. There are 5. And near the end of her life, she said, I'm sorry I ever came up with those. Because people made it a roadmap. Oh, I'm in the anger stage. I'm in the denial stage. I'm in the bargaining stage. And it was never designed to be a roadmap for grief. It was never designed to say, grief goes this way. It's linear. You go from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3 to stage 4 to stage 5, which finally is acceptance. That's not the way it works. It's not linear at all. It's this way. And it comes back, and then it goes forward, and then it comes back, and then it goes forward. And for some of us, that grieving is a lifetime experience. There's not an end to it. I've known families who've lost a child. It's destroyed the marriage because they couldn't get through the grieving. My own dad died when I was 26. He was killed in an accident at work, so it was very sudden. He lived less than 24 hours. I wasn't home. I was gone. I can't tell you how many times over the ensuing years I've wished I could talk to my dad about what it was like to be a dad. Raising 3 kids, he raised 4. And what it was like. So I maybe could get some wisdom from my dad that I might be able to apply to my own situation. I still see him in a dream. Now, I know he does not. He would be 100 now, and I know he's not in my dream. He's not 100. He's 53 years old. Occasionally, I hear his voice. Sometimes it's coming out of my mouth. But occasionally, I hear his voice. And I grieve that I didn't get a chance to know my dad as an adult myself and have those conversations. You know, that's only 40 plus years ago. Grieving is a lifetime thing. It does diminish over time, but it comes back. And if you're in a fresh grieving time, a picture, a smell, a sound, boom, there it is again. You find yourself weeping because something you saw or heard or smelled reminded you of someone who's gone. Grief. It's part of every time we say goodbye. Sometimes it's small, sometimes it's short, sometimes it's long. And sometimes one loss spins us back into the other loss. It happens. Her 5 stages of grief are denial because of the shock, anger because of the helplessness, bargaining. Could I have done something different? God, why didn't you take me? God, something should have been different. Depression, which I think is anger that I turn on me rather than turn on somebody else. Again, because of the helplessness. And then finally, stage 5 is accept it. It's history. It's part of who I am. But in those later years, she said, they are not a roadmap, not linear, not a race. There is no finish line. It's a process. And depending on how attached we were to the person or thing, intensifies the grief. And the third learning for me is that the value and joy of the hello 2015, the value and joy in that is in hindsight. So at the end of the year next year, looking back at 2015, I can say, wow. But I can't see it very well looking into it. Now, you hear people on the TV and on the radio prognosticating, reading in the paper what 2015 is going to bring. They don't have a clue. They don't have a clue. But one thing for sure, God's going to be with us. In fact, Paul tells us in the book of Romans, who will separate us from the love of God? Who? Or what? Will hardship? Or distress? Or persecution? Or famine? Or nakedness? Or peril? Or sword? And then he says, no. In English it says no. But in Greek it says, by no means, absolutely no. If you're sending this no as a text, it would be italics, it would be all caps, it would be bold, it would be underlined. Emphatic, no. No, he says, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am convinced, Paul says, and this seems to me to be a promise to us, that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God. What that tells me is that as I face 2015, I can face it with the confidence that I'm not going there by myself. That God is with me every breath of the way. And God is with you as well. Every breath you draw in 2015. And should the end of your life come in 2015, this promises God won't leave you then either. God, nothing, not even death, will be able to separate us from the love of God. So as we look back at 2014, I want to encourage you to see those things that happened in 2015 that were good, celebrate them, let them go. Those things that were not so good to you personally, I want you to look at those and let them go. Because 2014 is drawing quickly to a close. And only when you are able to say goodbye to all of 2014 will you truly be able to say hello to 2015. And when you say hello to 2015, know that God, our Creator, will be with us every breath of the way. Amen.